Thank you very much. Now it's time to welcome another very prestigious researcher with a long career in the fields. Last time I think we met Roy, it was in Berlin for a conference on chemical warfare, and I was publishing a paper on the French response to the German initiatives in Langemarck on April 22, 1915. So Roy has a very, very long and rich career in the field of chemical weapons, and published lots of books. Of course, and I think the subject you will address today is very interesting for us Europeans, because Australia is not far in terms of the distance, but it's also maybe sometimes far in terms of the way the country is perceived in terms of military and chemical programs, biological. For most European, Australia faced the first time chemical weapons with the soldier during the First World War, but then we don't know much about what did go on in Australia in this field. So you are going to help us understanding the relation of Australia with these chemical weapons. So Roy is a professor emeritus of history at the University of Sydney and a member of the University Centre for International Security Studies. He earned his PhD from Cambridge University, and he has led, I mean, you had a very international career, because you even worked in France for the CNRS and l'École des études en sciences sociales à Paris. And he had taught military and global history in Amsterdam, Göttingen, Hamburg, Stockholm, and Bologna. So quite a trip all over Europe. And he's also a fellow of the Australian Academy of Humanities, and the Academy also of the Social Science in Australia, and the Royal Historical Society, and the International Academy of History of Science. So, Roy, thank you to participate. The floor is yours, and I must maybe precise that Alan Shepard is the co-writer of your contribution. Yes, is that right?
Yes, that's right. And he unfortunately cannot be with us today. Thank you. Good. Thank you, everyone, for your patience. It's now 3:30. And we're supposed to break at 4, aren't we?
Yes.
So I will not detain you. I've shortened my remarks. You have the full paper,
yes, which
you can read at your leisure. Warm thanks, as all have said, to Aurora, to Christophe, and to Olivier, whose work I've admired for years.
Thank you. I'm
so glad to see you. I know you're a difficult man to pin down. We're really lucky to have you. I think it's in a curious way appropriate to have someone come from the end of the earth to speak at the end of the day, don't you think? And to give you some perspective, such as you may not already have, on what has happened in Australia and what is happening. If those of you who are French or present know what has happened with our submarine fiasco, you may be more or less unsympathetic to what I'm about to say.
Please do not address this subject. You have an incident during the conference.
I draw a veil over submarines. I will not mention the word again.
It's like talking rugby with an English guy. That subject you should avoid.
Oh dear. Well, I'm going to also tell you something about what is in fact an unwritten history, an unspoken set of stories, which to some extent reflect Australia's growing geopolitical awareness, which might otherwise be recognized in relation to those craft that float beneath the sea, the name of which I will not mention. The reality is that this notion of responsibility that we'll talk about in a moment, which has led Australia to take a very active role in international agreements, is bred of a series of epochs in Australian foreign policy. And it's to that journey that I want to address us. The public is not very much interested in chemical warfare in Australia. despite the news we get from Britain and the reality, in fact, of the threat that we face. But drawing upon neglected documents, my friend Alan Shepard and I have managed to get together a fair deal of information, not just from Australia, but from Vienna and from other places, from the States and from England, of course, to cast the whole subject of Australia's role in this story in a slightly more positive light. And I've, just for the sake, you'll see from the paper, I've tried to divide these policy epochs, if you like, into 4 periods. The first of which has to do pretty much with Australia's initial experience of chemical warfare during the First World War, as you mentioned. Australian troops suffered from and themselves operated within the chemical regime. Many were victims of it and came back, and it continues to be an issue in Australian legal terms, even today. But Australia's approach after the First War was not so much a concern dominated by fear, such as we've heard many times expressed during the day, not a fear, but a more utilitarian notion of whether it was really worth having the issue of chemical weapons. This notion of what we've called active accommodation or tacit acceptance, generally speaking, looking to London for guidance where we could find it, was the dominant tendency in much of Australian policy, not least because the conditions of federation in 1901 gave national defense to the UK. It reserved the defense of Australia to the Royal Navy, basically. But our general sense in relation to the subject of chemical warfare was dealt with to a certain extent by this large number of Australians. Australia sent over 100 chemists to Britain to start greenfield sites, many of them in chemical factories. Some of them in Bath, for example, Avonmouth, in poison gas work. And we're also, of course, Australia also played an important part in the mineral supply that became important to the negotiation of munitions manufacture. So there was a good deal of experience, and in fact, many of these returning Australians then became active in the continuing relationship between Australia and the UK. The UK, of course, being the dominant partner in that relation. And in a sense, that characterized a period of what we have called acquisition and acquiescence. We saw, however, a change in the drift of policy from the late 60s, when we saw a number of people in Canberra become concerned about its recent past. And certainly since the 1980s, yet another shift in Australia has become actively engaged with international efforts to outlaw the use of chemical and biological weapons. And policy in this last phase, I think we try to characterize as driven by strategic avoidance and by the precepts of international consensus and agreement. And this is what now largely frames Australia's foreign policy in this area. We've had a certain difficulty in retrieving our archives in this field, but we've brought together what we can from the countries I mentioned earlier. Still, there's a lot yet to be found, and not least because Australians were indistinguishable from Englishmen for a very considerable period of time, unless you heard them speak, of course. But the fact of the matter is that serving in Britain was something that one did if one were Australian. And this happened from the RAF through the Merchant Navy across the board. So to distinguish and extract a particular Australian view is often a little problematic and perhaps unnecessary. But we see at the end of the war, at least, a growing sense of Australian independence in of mind in these ways, which was, alas, compromised, of course, by growing dependence upon the United States. So if you go too deeply into CW policy and you go to Maryland and to Edworth and other places, and you are welcomed as an Australian because you're thought to be not British, basically, but then you also spoke English. So this is to our advantage. I guess most recently, this relationship of cognates has come into focus in the announcement of so-called AUKUS, A-U-K-U-S. You may have caught the French of this: Australia, United Kingdom, and United States, which in fact grew up and around the submarine issue, but now it has a much broader connotation. It has to do with a number of fields of strategy, but also of technical cooperation. Well, as I've said, the policy of what we call active accommodation lasted really until the outbreak of the Second World War. Then we had a long period in which we looked increasingly to the UK, but by 1942, or 43 probably, the focus was the United States, and it has remained the United States really with interruption since then. But the focus on the United States has not been uncritical. And increasingly, especially during Vietnam and afterwards, of course, Australian troops served with the United States in Vietnam and saw the uses of chemical warfare there and came away very chastised by that experience, which in our view has led to what we call a policy of autonomy, in which Australian governments embrace a posture of campaigning for measures to ban the research, development, testing, and use of CWW in all forms. Well, this particular sense of rejection and acceptance was, I think, part of the broader way in which Australia was seeking to find its own place in the world. The relationship with the United States was almost axiomatic once the Pacific War had come to Australia. It was the United States and not Britain that rescued Australia from the Japanese, or the threat of invasion. It's the United States that stockpiled chemical weapons in Australia to be used against the Japanese had they invaded Australia. And it was the United States that also stockpiled chemical weapons in Queensland, in Northern Australia, to be used at the very end of the war when Japanese resistance to the islands of the Japanese archipelago were threatened by invasion. These stockpiles were never used in anger. They were disposed of in the wake of the war, but the fact is that we now carry that as a burden because fishermen are still finding barrels of mustard gas that were dumped in the sea after August 1945. So we have a lingering memory of Australia's participation in a war not of our making, in which we depended very much on allies to save us. Now, the relationship with the United States, though, which to our mind was built really on the exchange of chemical information in order to defeat the Japanese, led to a series of agreements of a much broader kind. Standardization agreements, especially, by which Australian Army, Navy, and Air Force elements were assigned American equipment, and insofar as local manufacture was involved, adopted American specifications. This reached a kind of culmination point in July '65, when the United States invited Australia to join what was called then the Tripartite Technical Cooperation Program, tripartite as between the United States, Britain, and Canada. This became the model, if you like, for technology sharing. It was very important that Australians learned how to do this, partly because some of the Australians I mentioned earlier, who had been in Britain during the Great War, had become chemical engineers. They had not only made chemical armaments, but they had actually produced a national system of innovation, but for the making of chemical armaments that Britain had lacked. Australians turned out to be much more receptive to German, to French, to American example than their British counterparts. And it was this receptiveness, this almost, I say, elasticity of view that gave them the cutting edge in many ways. Well, the extent of cooperation with the United States was tested during Vietnam, and the history of Agent Orange, as you know, was perhaps the worst part of that story. And indeed, we continue to see the Vietnam Veterans Association of Australia launching a number of test cases in our administrative test tribunals. These are Australian servicemen who suffered from American weapons. The untold number of the Vietnamese also suffered from these weapons, clearly too. But it tested the resolve of the Australian Army to continue this degree of unquestioning acceptance. And I think this even reached to the extent of research into chemical weapons, not just their accession and potential use. Well, the Australian government policy was also very conscious of the need to establish itself in relation to the sensibilities generated in and around the Geneva Protocol. Australia had signed the protocol in 1930. Of course, the US didn't accede to the protocol until 1975. But it was, if you like, with the sense that we were somehow being played, that led a number of people in Australia to propose meetings that would regulate some of the initial sources of chemicals that would later form or find a place in weapons. And this led in June of 1985 to the establishment of something called the Australia Group, following a UN investigation into Iraq's CW program. And in this informal role, the Australian government remains, even today, at the forefront of international efforts. The US also, of course, shares the Australian commitment for the banning of CBW, but I think Australia in Washington has taken a particularly important role in persuading the State Department to keep up its efforts. Well, in summary, really, and I wanted just to open the floor to conversation on this as fresh news surrounding CW continues to appear. The history of the subject, and I find when it's mentioned in public circles, is taken seriously, it remains of vital importance. The implications of current usage around the world, as we well know, are brought into our foreign policy conversations and courses. But as I see it anyways, policy in Australia is at an intersection, possibly a crossroads. Beyond providing for the preventative training of defense and security people, and beyond being a sort of object lesson for students of desk-bound tactics and strategy and science diplomacy, Australians have yet to be stirred or even shaken by the subject. We continue to send troops for tropical training by contract these days to Thailand in imitation of, perhaps in support of, potential American investment in our region, and the northern third of Australia, the tropics, now are receiving a great many US forces, and as part of the Obama-led tilt towards Asia, which we're now seeing finally materialize. And these American troops are being taught how to use chemical weapons in the tropics. So we may well see a totally new dimension like of that sort open. There's a second thing, though, that I'd like to leave you with, and that is any future shift in CW policy will reflect on the sense of sovereignty that Australia has or has left, given the dominance of the United States in so many ways. There seems no local interest, at least, in deviating from established conventions and commitments, which present Australia to the world in the form of a helpful international power looking to manage great power sensitivities. And that, I think, is what many people on both sides of Parliament would seek to maintain. And in this way, as the current, now recently elected Labour PM has put it, it is our policy to cooperate where we can, disagree where we must. And this, as a feature of policy, I think, suggests that we have to see Australia as balancing and compromising. There is no difficulty at all, and as you will know, the Chemical Weapons Convention rode very considerably on the backs of Australian and New Zealand negotiators. But on the other hand, the test seems to become one of compromise and assimilation of others' views. And I think that's what Australians are seeking. However, a test of all this may well come, and we will wait and see. Where will Australia stand? I hope on the side of the angels. Thank you.
Thank you very much.